Okay, so I would like to welcome Souza, who will be talking about lighting for both videos and stills tonight. And Anne works for Light in Motion and is based out of Monterey. So working for Light in Motion, she certainly knows quite a bit about light. So as we go through the presentation, make sure to keep yourself muted unless you have a question. And with that, we'll hand the reins over to Anne. So welcome.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Thanks everyone for having me here tonight. It's an honor to be here talking a little bit more about underwater lighting with all of you guys. And yeah, I'm excited to chat a little bit. If you have any questions at any moment of, this talk, please don't hesitate in just asking me in the middle of the presentation. I'll try to pause. But yeah, if you have any questions, just go ahead and let me know right away. And then we'll do another session after we finalize as well. All right, so go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys all see my screen? Yep. All right. Cool. So we'll be
It says it's
talking.
loading on my
Loading.
end.
All right. So you can try it again. Does it work now?
I can see it. Yep, that's for sure.
All right.
So
Perfect. Some technical issues apart.
no, actually, so whenever you go to share it, then it goes into the loading view.
Okay, so I guess this works.
You can just do it like this. This works.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the power of continuous lighting precisely for stills and video, right? But first, a little bit more about me. So hi, my name is Annie. I'm an underwater photographer, scuba instructor, and I'm directing the marketing team at Light in Motion, which is a dive lights and underwater imaging lights manufacturer based here in Marina in California. So very nearby Monterey. I got certified to dive here in Monterey. So most of my dives are cold water dives. And I've learned how I got into underwater photography also here in Monterey. So yeah, most of my experience is out here, although I am from Brazil. But while growing up, I was always fascinated by filming, photography, and water. So my dad was very big on always carrying a camera around everywhere he went. And I think I certainly inherit that from him. And nowadays, I'm lucky enough to had the opportunity to learn more about both fields, both scuba diving and underwater photography. And now it is extremely rewarding to be able to merge both passions and get to dive and explore the underwater world while I'm also, capturing moments and memories underwater. There is something very, very special about being able to use your perspective to capture a moment and then sew all these moments together to tell a story. It is a powerful communication tool. And to be able to use photography underwater is incredibly rewarding, refreshing, and it certainly re-energizes me to be able to be in an environment where not a lot of people can say that they are able to visit or to even know, and to share a little bit more about this underwater world with like friends, family, coworkers, everyone that's interested, right? It's hard to care about something you're not connected with. And photography is a way to connect people to something that they don't have a lot of familiarity with. So most divers have experienced at some point something that didn't feel quite right during their dives, right? Maybe it was, a mask that was fogging up, a regulator free flow, or dang it, your computer died right before the dive. So, and when you add an entire camera and underwater housing and lights to that, then you need to consider at least, 15 additional things before, during, and after your dive. So that's why preparation is key, right? So before, getting in the water, or if you have a dive or dive trip plan, is always, smarter to get all of your dive gear and camera gear prepared on the night before, so you don't do anything, you don't rush anything, right? You're able to clean your O-rings to make sure you have all of your your batteries charged, you have like space on your SD card. You take that test shot and you check the image to make sure that the cap is not in there inside the housing, and that you have an SD card in. That happened to me before and it was extremely frustrating. And so you don't have to do things rush, and you don't end up like letting things fall through the crack. And like the moment one thing goes wrong, more things tend to like build up. So it's nice to be prepared and get everything ready ahead of time. Also, always charge your light batteries, or if they have been stored for a long period of time, is always a great idea to check on the battery status for those lights as well. Well, once you're out there in the dive site and, getting ready for your photo dive, most photographers, when they're getting started, they don't really use lights. They shoot mostly with natural lighting, which is great. You're able to get incredible images with just natural light. But there are also limitations to only shooting with natural light, right? The first big limitation is that you don't have control over conditions, right? You don't know how visibility is going to be looking like, or you can have an idea, but you can't control it. You don't know if it will be a sunny day or a cloudy day. Also, if you want to have vivid colors, then you're limited by depth at that point. So you can't go much deeper without losing a lot of the colors. Also, by just using natural lighting, you sometimes get harsh shadows that you're unable to feel, and limited contrast, which can result in like flat looking images and less detail or less depth. Here, I was going to show something. Okay, yeah. So in this mode, I wasn't able to do the presentation animation there. But so as most divers know, right, as you get deeper or further away from your subject, you lose a lot of the colors, right, from the color spectrum. That's because water absorbs light in a much different way than air does. So water will filter out the colors based on the wavelength of each color, right? So in the first, like 3 feet, you're gonna start losing your pinks, 10 to 15, your reds, oranges, yellows, greens, violets, and blue later on over 200 feet. Of course, this will depend on water clarity and conditions in general. But if you're going deeper than, like 15 feet, you're already not going to have the same colors as vivid as you would if you were right on the, like the surface. For that reason, you want to be able to add a different source of light to your images to bring those colors back to life. So here is the same image. This was taken at around 60 feet deep and in my first leave aboard in St. Kitts in the Caribbean. And you can notice that by adding, by turning on my video lights, I was able to bring back all of the colors that were lost before. So that's a huge difference, like a huge difference for underwater imaging in general, photography or videographer. It really gives you the ability to add light, add detail, contrast, and you have the ability to also create a lot more creative lighting as well. For this image, I was using Souza Video Pro 15000s by Light Emotion. Great. So this photo here was captured in Carmel River. I was also using the same two lights. As you can see, I was only able to capture this image because I was lighting up the other side of the jelly. Otherwise, I would most likely not be able to see this beautiful yellow from the egg yolk jelly and the details from the tentacles. It would be a lot darker. Of course, you can always edit the image afterwards in post-processing, but the closer you can get from the final result in the camera, the better your image will be, right? So my ISO here was 100, my shutter speed was 1/60th of a second, and my f-stop was 9. And then here, I'm just gonna talk a little bit more about the advantages of using constant lighting for not only video, but also stills, right? So this image, I was also using the same lights, right? I use ISO 400, shutter speed 1/60th of a second, and f-stop 9. You can see how I was able to balance it out, the ambient light that was overall lighting the background with my artificial light that's lighting the bottom of the image here. Video lights in general are extremely versatile. So if you don't already have lighting, it is usually the first light source you're gonna buy. That's because one, you can do both videos and stills with the same light. You can also even use it as a focus light or as a dive light. So you have a lot of flexibility. You can do both macro or wide angle, depending on how powerful your light is as well. Another great advantage of constant lighting in comparison to strobes per se is that is much easier to learn with constant versus strobes. And the reason for that is because you can see the light. It works just like ambient lighting. So you can see the light in real time, the preview of your camera, and adjust the settings as you like. You can also adjust the angles of your light to avoid backscatter. So you have a lot more control before taking that shot. Cool. So as you're getting into the water, it is always very, very important to understand the environment you're about to get into and make a couple of assessments, right? Assessing the natural light condition is very important. So take a look on where the sun is coming from, the angle of the sun, right? If there is any potential additional light sources or openings or reflections, because you can use all of those to balance it out on your composition as well. So you can use that in your favor, along with water clarity, all of that. But yeah, balancing natural light with artificial light, it is crucial to create a properly exposed and a visually appealing image. For this image right here, I honestly, for this one, I was very shallow that I didn't need to use much of artificial lighting, but I was using the top of the kelp canopy as a barrier against the sun, so you could see the sun rays coming through the canopies. And that's something I like to do a lot here in Monterey. I like to look for an area that's covered by kelp and really let the sunlight do its job, you know, so I can capture those beautiful sun rays traveling through the water. That's one of my favorite things to do when diving and photographing kelp. But yeah, this image, you know, like ISO was 160, shutter speed was 1/60 of a second, and f-stop was 9. So how can you use ambient light to your advantage, right? So when shooting in constant mode, you really want to balance it out, you know, your constant light with ambient light. The ambient light is going to light up the overall scene, and then the artificial light is going to light up, you know, like a focal point on your image. So I personally like to get closer from a reef or a fish and then light up that area and let the ambient light, you know, do its job in the background there. I also like to use, you know, like silhouette of divers in the background for framing, or as you can see on the second image there, the bull kelp, to create that beautiful frame around the image as well. With constant light, you're also able to match. Ideally, you want to match the color temperature of the light with the natural light. So nowadays you have different color filters. Some are blue, some are green, that you can add to your light to have that perfect white balanced of your lights with your camera. And of course, the more you get in the water and in different environments with different light sources, right? Constant strobes, you learn more about like what you like to do and what you feel comfortable shooting. I personally love to shoot with constant light because in most of my dives, I'm doing both stills and videos. I like to switch around. And constant lights are the only light sources that allow you to do both on the same dive. So I'm easily able to switch modes. Great. And then, you know, aside from, you know, all the heavy gear and underwater housing and all of the different challenges, right, that underwater photographers face compared to topside photographers, there is one thing that normal photographers don't have to worry about, and that's backscatter. So there are a couple of techniques to minimize backscatter. What is backscatter, actually? Backscatter is when you notice all these specks and haze floating on your image, and they're caused by the light reflecting off particles or even organisms in the water, right? So, and they're caused mostly by direct light or indirect light. So if you, by your lights or another diver's light or even natural light sometimes, depending on the angle that is hitting. There are a couple of ways to minimize backscatter. The first one is that, you know, that method that all of us learned in our open water course, right? We want to really be aware of our buoyancy and really have that dialed in. So maintaining neutral buoyance, doing the frog kick to avoid kicking up particles up on the water column, that's gonna already be extremely helpful. The less particles that are floating around, the less little things that are to reflect on your lens. Another thing you can do is the editing your images, right? So you can try and fix it in post-processing. It's never going to be as good as if you took the image without the backscatter in the first place. But that's an option in case, you know, you want to minimize or eliminate a couple of those little specks. Now, you can also do some light positioning, right? So the way you have your lights positioned underwater, that's going to have a huge effect on minimizing backscatter. You can strategically position your strobes or video lights behind the dome port there and at a slight outward angle. You want to have it at around like 45 degrees out. The whole goal is that you're going to light up your subject with the edge of the cone of light, right? So each light will have a different beam angle. It can vary from like very narrow beams, let's say like 8-degree beam that's very tight to 130, right? So you want to light up your subject from both ends with just the edge of the cone of light from both lights. And the reason you want to do that is because then you're not lighting up the water between the camera lens and your subject. You're only lighting up your subject. So that will minimize all the particles that get reflected between the camera lens and the subject. So that works very well if you have two light sources. So if you have two video lights or two strobes. Now, if you only have one video light or one strobe, you want to move your strobe up to the center of the housing, also behind the dome, and then facing slightly upwards as well. So you have that same cone of light lighting up the subject, and you don't have anything lighting up between the lens and the subject. But yeah, so that's another cool tip to minimize backscatter. Right. So now let's talk a little bit more about, you know, like the right or the better settings for constant lighting, right? When you're shooting strobes versus constant lighting is a completely different game if you're shooting in manual mode. Because one, when you're using strobes, you don't really need to worry about your shutter speed, right? Unless you want to make your background darker versus bluer. But constant light is a lot more similar to ambient light, right? So you want to use, you can use much slower shutter speeds as well, right? But before we get there, let me track back a little bit and just talk a little bit about the relationship here in the exposure triangle, right? So it comprises, when you're shooting in, you know, manual mode, it comprises the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And then these three factors will dictate, you know, the exposure of your image, right? But these three factors, they all come with little side effects. So the aperture controls depth of field, right? So you can create that bokeh effect, that blurry background on your photos, or that very large depth of field with a lot of details in your image. Shutter speed will blur or freeze action. And ISO can add or subtract film grain or digital noise from your images. So the rule of thumb for, as far as settings when you're using constant lighting, is to have your shutter speed between 1/60th of a second to 1/125 of a second. And of course, if you have very fast moving objects or animals, then you may have to increase your shutter speed to freeze that that image. But then you might have a little bit less light overall. Yeah, so I like to do that, or a lot of people also set their shutter priority and let the camera do the rest when using constant lights as well. You can also play around with, like, we can be very creative. You can play around with backlighting, side lighting, and even long exposure shots, because constant lights are constantly on. You can just have very, very long shutter speeds and create something that is a little bit more unusual. Yes, okay, so, oh, and this image here, I also took in that same trip to the Caribbean. ISO 100. My shutter speed was 1/80th of a second, and f-stop was 4.5. As you can see, most of, when you're shooting with constant lights, to get a crisp image and not a blurred image, most of the animals are very slow. If they're very fast moving animals, you need a lot more light to be able to freeze action. Or you can create, like long exposure shots, but you're definitely you could notice a little bit more blur depending on the situation. Cool. So here, I'm gonna go over a couple of practical, considerations and tips, right? So you can always use a very wide aperture for that blurry background, that bokeh effect. A small aperture will require a lot more light, and then the wide aperture will require less light. As you all know, focus on those eyes or rhinophores, because that's the first thing that people usually see in an image is the eyes or the rhinophores. And, with constant lights, if you can't touch it, you can't light it. Not that you're supposed to touch it, but it's just a saying for you to have that in your mind, that you got to be very close from your subject. When you think you're closer, get a little closer. And yeah, always, this is for both, any type of photography, but by shooting in RAW, like, you get a lot more dynamic range to post-process your images. So it gives you a lot more room when editing later on. So yeah, this photo right here was taken right at the Breakwater Cove, and also with constant lights, ISO 320. My shutter speed was 1/200th of a second, and aperture was f4. And now I'm just gonna jump into, it's not a very high quality GIF, but it's just mostly to show something that's coming out and is pretty new. Like, nowadays we talk a lot about, either or, right? Constant lights or strobes. But now there are more tools coming out to the market. There are a lot of the hybrid lights, right? Lights that will do both constant and burst. And I think the really key part is they will do both. And depending on the light, it will be more photo oriented or video oriented, right? So Light in Motion, we just released actually this light here this month. It is called Sola X Video Hybrid, and it is a 10,000 lumen light that bursts in 20,000 lumens. So you can connect a fiber optic cable to your camera trigger, and then you're gonna get twice as much power in burst versus in continuous. The great advantage of that is, one, you can do videos and stills. And if you don't like to take stills with video lights, because sometimes light may scare wildlife. With this light, now you can set them up on burst mode and get much closer from your subject, and then just fire the burst. Since it is an LED light, it also has no recycle time and no misfires, so it can light up your subject back to back to back up to 30 frames per second with no recycle time. This is a GIF. The quality is not very good, but it is an image that I took like several images, lit up images of my dive buddy with Sola X. And Sola X is actually has a much higher frame rate than my camera. So it could actually fire up much faster than this. So yeah, super exciting. It is one of the first light and motion lights that has a swappable battery. So you can swap batteries, it is USB-C powered. So a lot of cool things that are coming out to the market right now that are increasing the creative possibilities, right? So now when you go on a dive trip, sometimes it may be a little bit easier to pack, because now you don't need to bring as many light systems if you're planning to do both video or stills. So yeah, this is something exciting that's out right now. And I was blown away when I got to dive it, and I just saw how fast these lights can fire up, without losing any power, which is exciting. Cool. And then here I just wanted to move over to video real quick. I focused most part of my presentation in stills, because that's what I do the most. But it's been, I think, a little bit over a year that I started doing videos. And I comprise a couple of the things that I learned during this past year, right? So, when you're doing underwater video, you want to shoot at least with your resolution in full HD. That's what most computers and TVs are set up. If you're able to go to 4K, yeah, of course, but just make sure that it is going to be a heavier file to edit later on. So if you're able to do that on your computer, great. Otherwise, just keep that in mind. And then you always want to have your shutter speed to be double whatever the frame rate you're utilizing on your camera. So most videographers, they shoot in 30 FPS, right? So if you're shooting in 30 FPS, you want to have your shutter speed set at 1/60 of a second. If you have your shutter speed slower than that, what happens is you're going to notice a motion blur, higher motion blur. And if you have your shutter speed higher, you're going to notice that that video is stopping, several times. And then for slow motion, you want to shoot at higher. For slow motion, you want to set your frame rate capability to, let's say, 120 or 60 FPS. And then whenever you're editing, then you edit at 30 FPS. So what happens in that when you're editing is you're going to stretch that clip from 1 second into 4 seconds. But your camera, whenever you were shooting, took 120 or 60 frames of that same second. So it has all the information it needs to stretch out that clip and transform into a nice slow motion clip. Right? And then with video, you're minimizing backscatter to begin with, because you're not freezing motion, right? So the particles are constantly moving, so they're not reflecting and getting frozen on the image. But, the same rule of the light source positioning applies here. So if you want to minimize backscatter, make sure you have your lights behind your dome and then facing outwards a little bit, and then illuminate your subject with the edge of the cone of light. And then the last thing, most important for video, of course, you want to make sure that your as stable as possible. You want to minimize movement, and a still clip is better than a shaking pan out clip, right? And it's very hard, you know, like I'm still learning how to keep myself stable. Those underwater tripods are very useful for that as well. If you're doing macro, or even, yeah, for macro, that would be extremely helpful. So yeah, you know, experiment a lot with continuous lighting. And, you know, like a video light is great for shooters that are primarily doing video, but also photos. Someone that may need a dive light, someone that is trying to get the action without worrying about the recycle time of a strobe, and someone that wants to have creative room to play with lighting and, you know, add backlighting, side lighting, all of that. So this is it, but I wanted to ask if any of you guys have any questions, and we can go back and go over them right now. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you. One question I had that I hadn't really thought much about, because like I never really shoot video, but inspired me to think about it from a photo perspective, like coming from video, or from that mindset. And particularly about backscatter, thinking about being able to minimize it, and how like video you kind of naturally somewhat reduce it because kind of it's kind of moving through the frame and all that. If you were to do stills but with a slower shutter speed, kind of like do you end up seeing kind of a similar effect, or?
Yes, that's a natural effect. So the tendency is to have a little bit less backscatter with lower shutter speeds.
Might need to play around with that some more just to see kind of what
Mhm.
happens. I never really do much for the slower shutter speeds on stills, but God, I hate backscatter, so maybe I'll have to play
Me
around with
too.
that.
I think all of us, right?
For sure.
But that was a great question.
I'm curious, what lights are you using then, or how many lumens?
The ones I was using for this photos are the Sola Video Pro 15,000s,
Ooh,
these
okay.
guys. But we just released a new light right now at Light Emotion that is a hybrid. That's the one that I was talking about, is Sola X Video Hybrid. And it does have 10,000 lumens in constant, but it does have twice as much in burst. So for a fraction of a second, you're gonna get that 20,000 lumen burst. And you know, like when you have very, very powerful lights, depending on where you are, it's kind of hard to take photos of maybe sea lions or fish because they get scared, right? So you either gotta dim your lights, or, you know, that's when the burst would come in very, very handy, because then it allows you to get much closer from your subject. And you can use the constant light as a focus light and then just fire off the burst in the same light.
So earlier you said that the shutter speed you recommended, like, I think it was 1/60th of a second up to, like, was it 250?
Usually I usually stick around between 1/60th and 1/25 of a second. That's usually the range. Like when I go over my photos, all my settings are kind of around that same shutter speed. Like sometimes I do have images that I didn't notice and I was a little bit higher. But that's the rule of thumb. Yes.
Okay.
And this is very good unless you're shooting very fast moving animals. So if using macro, if you're doing macro or if you're shooting like most fish here, you're completely fine with those.
Hey, can I ask you a question about you're using Light and Motion's best equipment. And most of us have some of the older equipment, like I started with a 500 focus light, and now I have a couple, I don't know, 2000s. So they're kind of old in comparison with the new stuff. And they don't, I tried taking stills in Channel Islands with 2 of these, and I just got too much blur. What can you actually, what power do you need for Monterey Bay?
Okay. For stills. Yeah, for stills, I would say if you're looking for something compact, the Sola Video Pro 3800s are a good option. You know, they're very good for macro, but then depending on the situation, if you're looking for like bigger wide angle situations, then you can also look into the Sola X too, because that's going to have 10,000 lumens. So it's going to be a lot more powerful. But yeah, as far as a compact light setup, that's going to be very good for macro and then good if you're close from your subject. Then I would say the Sola Video Pro 3800, which is this size here, very lightweight.
So, but it won't light up any of the background like the kelp and stuff, like when you're
No, usually it's hard to light up an entire scene just with video lights. What I would say, what I personally do is I get much closer. I find like a reef or something, or like a sea star, something that I can get very, very close to, and then I light up that area, and then I let ambient light do the job in the background, because it's very hard to light up like a huge area. You got to be very close from your subject.
So that photo that you had with the nudibranch up front and the kelp in the back,
Yeah.
you use that new Sola X and it puts out way more power, isn't it going to blow out the nudibranch?
No, you can always dim the power if it is too much, but I don't think it would. Because let me see on settings. Okay, so my settings on that photo, I'll share my screen. Okay, so my settings on this photo here was ISO 320, right? So if I had, let's say, too much power, then I would just lower my ISO to 100 if it is too much. And then if it's still too much, then I lower the intensity of the light, or I play around with the settings here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is a type of photo you should be able to take even with a Sola 2000 or a Sola 3800, because as you can see, I'm very close from my subject and I'm lighting. The only part that I'm lighting here is the nudibranch and the reef.
Oh, okay. So a couple 2000s to be able to do that. Maybe I was probably shooting things that were moving like 5 feet out.
No, yeah, no, you got to be much closer.
Okay. Yeah, well, you know, once you can see in the water, distance becomes different than here. Usually everything's like, you can kind of tell how close things are. Okay.
Totally.
I also like that yolk jelly that you've got. I'd love to get a shot like that. That's really good.
Thank you. That's one of my favorites. The egg yolk jelly I was so excited when I got to see all this. Yeah, egg yolk jelly swimming between the bull kelp. It was one of my best dives, and I was very seasick. I think I threw up after taking this photo, but you know how we are all, right? We've got to focus on getting the shot, but
Yeah. Great.
Continuous lighting that with lights that bright, do you have problems with other divers complaining that you're shooting them in the eyes?
So in Monterey, I never had that issue before, but I went to the Caribbean for the first time, and it was a lot of people in a liveaboard. So I had to be very aware of my surroundings. You know, like I was really trying not to like blind people. You know, so you definitely got to be aware of like who's around you.
For the hybrid flashes, just out of curiosity, are those when you're in burst mode, is the video mode all or is the constant light also always on, or can you use them from just a burst mode without the constant being on?
Yes, so you can set both modes independently and you can use them together or separate. So you can have constant and then you have your burst. Let's say you can have your constant on the lowest setting to maximize runtime, and you have your burst on the highest setting, right? So that's kind of like you're using your constant as a focus, and then you have your burst as a 20,000 lumen light. So that's going to extend the runtime of your light to 20 hours. Or you can have the light completely off and then just have the burst to fire up. And yes, I think that's pretty much it.
I have another question about equipment. Are you using a monitor when you're doing video? You know, an
Mhm.
external monitor?
No, I wish. That's I wanna get a couple of things. A monitor is on my list. I want a little underwater tripod, but I'm just using my a GH5, so that's my camera setup right here. It's just this one. And yeah, I just look everything right here in the back. Sometimes I can't really see how the image is gonna look until, you know, I'm editing afterwards.
Right.
Yeah.
I tried a monitor once and it just made all the difference in the world, but it's so expensive.
I'm sure. Yeah. I'm drooling over
Cost.
monitors.
Yeah.
So that hybrid light, does it have the capability of like doing like a red light for like the back, you know, like for the focus? You know, you could instead of the does it have that?
No, it doesn't. It's daylight balanced only. What it does is not red light, but it has field replaceable optics. So you can change the clear optic for blue water domes or green water domes for white balancing. And then we also developed a spot optic, which narrows the beam from 115 underwater to 12. And that will also intensify the light on a smaller area. Very good for macro photography, or if you're trying to isolate a background and minimize even more backscatter, to really focus the light. But yes, we don't have any red light on that light specifically.
Yeah, because that would be really handy for some species that are, get spooked pretty easy with light.
Totally. No, I completely understand. For that, we have a photo 1200, which is the small one that has the white light, red light. But I know having everything in one light would be very convenient.
Any other questions? Then thank you again to Anne. Fantastic presentation. It's always good to hear about lighting. It's something I myself get frustrated with on every single dive. So
Always
any
learning,
tip and
right?
trick.
Yeah, that's one of those things. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here talking with all of you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to switch over to NCUPS. So for May, our theme is negative space. And I think I've got things set up. In preparation for it, I am going to put the link to vote in the chat. Oh, I just closed out of what I didn't want to close out of.